Hello, everyone, and welcome to our AirMiners event. My name is Jason Grillo, the event director for AirMiners. Pleased today to welcome Tim Flannery, Australian environmentalist and TED Talk speaker, who is going to be in conversation with us today, talking about ocean and mineralization strategies for carbon removal. He'll be interviewed today by Katherine Vaz Gomes of the University of Pennsylvania. Katherine is a PhD candidate in chemical engineering at the Clean Energy Conversions Laboratory at UPenn. She earned her undergraduate degree in chemical engineering from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and her current work focuses on carbon mineralization. I'm happy to share the stage with Katherine now so that she can introduce Tim and start our event proper. Thank you.
Hello, AirMiners. It's my honor to introduce you to Tim Flannery. Explorer and Professor Tim Flannery seeks to grasp the bigger picture of planetary evolution and how humans can affect it, for better or for worse. Having published more than 140 academic papers, named 25 living and 50 fossilized mammalian species, and over 20 years experience conducting research in New Guinea and surrounding countries, Tim Flannery combines evolutionary biology, earth sciences, paleontology, and conservationism, and his role as a climate activist. He began publishing books in 1990 with Mammals of New Guinea, and his most recent book was published just last year, titled The Climate Cure: Solving the Climate Emergency in the Era of COVID-19. And in 2005, he landed on the New York Times bestseller list with his book, The Weather Makers. His resume boasts so many incredibly prestigious positions, including a professorship at the University of Adelaide, director of the South Australian Museum, principal research scientist at the Australian Museum, and as a visiting chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University. He served on the board of the World Wildlife Foundation, the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, and as an advisor to the National Geographic Society. For more than a decade, he served as presenter on ABC Radio, NPR, and the BBC. Currently, Tim is the Chief Councillor at the Australian Climate Council, Australia's leading climate communications organization that provides authoritative information, advice, and solutions about climate change for Australian citizens. In 2007, he was named Australian of the Year, and in 2019, he presented a TED Talk on the main stage focused on the carbon removal potential of seaweed and kelp farming in the deep ocean. Sir David Attenborough once described him as being in the league of all-time great explorers. He comes to AirMiners with decades of experience being a world-renowned scientist, explorer, conservationist, and environmental advocate. And I am so glad to introduce you to a conversation with Tim Flannery.
Thank you all for joining. Good evening to you all. I guess most of you are in the US. Look, what I wanted to do today was to really paint the broad picture, I guess, of drawdown, but focus particularly on two very promising pathways that I think offer the best options at the moment for drawdown at scale. So let's have a look at the drawdown challenge. We now know, following IPCC 6th assessment report, that drawdown is absolutely essential to stay below 2 degrees of warming. We have already gone past the time when we could stabilise at 1.5, looking at that report, and probably the best we could do is 1.7, 1.8. But all of the pathways that keep us below 2 degrees of warming require large amounts of drawdown, and that's usually expressed in the IPCC modelling as BECCS, B-E-C-C-S, biological energy carbon capture and storage. The reason that is used to cover a whole number of possible pathways is that BECCS is easy to model. You can work out the amount to be captured, you can put it into geological rocks, and it's a simple equation. Dealing with something like seaweed, not so simple. Still lots of scientific gaps, and if we were to use seaweed or silicate rocks, for example, as a pathway to sequestration, it would be much harder to model. So BECCS stands in for everything else. I just want to point out how quickly the problem has grown and how the need for drawdown has become ever more urgent. And my yardstick for this is really an event in my life. I remember in 2007, I was made Australian of the Year for championing addressing climate change. Since then, since 2007, humanity has put up over a quarter of all of the greenhouse gases we have ever emitted in our history. So just in the last 14 years, we've done that. So the problem is growing rapidly. The gigatons required of drawdown are growing rapidly, and the opportunities to develop these pathways is growing ever more urgent. So what sort of scale are we looking at? well, of course, the scale of drawdown that we would require depends upon how much we continue to emit. At the moment, we are looking at a scale of tens of gigatons a year anyway, probably in the low tens for some decades to get back on track. And it's important to understand as you look at that gigatonnage figure that, of course, drawing the gas out of the air has consequences for the ocean. So what that means is that we draw CO2 out of the air, the oceans then outgas because the partial pressure of CO2 across the ocean atmosphere boundary alters and CO2 comes into the atmosphere. What that means is that to draw down 1 part per million or draw down sufficient CO2 to lower temperature or lower concentrations in the atmosphere by 1 part per million, what that means is we have to draw out 18 gigatons of CO2. So that's quite a large volume, as you can imagine. I mean, it's the scale of the drawdown challenge that really is front and center of the whole issue. A gigaton is 1 billion tons of carbon. To give you a sense of the scale that we're looking at there, if you imagine planting the entire lower 48 states of the USA in forest, on average over a century, you might draw down 8 gigatons or so of CO2. So these are very, very big numbers that we're talking about. And we're talking about planetary scale interventions. And of course they have to be, because the planetary scale intervention that we triggered with the Industrial Revolution, we're talking about winding that back. So we're talking about very, very large scale changes. It's also important when we think about drawdown to think about the certainty and duration of sequestration. Now, this is a key challenge. How long will the carbon remain sequestered and how secure is that sequestration going to be? I'd like to just draw one example from recent science that tells us how difficult this can sometimes be. You may all know that the soil carbon resource is about twice as large as the living carbon resource. So what that means is if you see a forest, you know, that you can roughly estimate the amount of carbon or that congealed carbon in the trees and plants. Imagine there's twice as much in the soils. It was thought that a lot of the carbon in the soils was highly durable, carbon in the form of charcoal, humus, and so forth. But recent studies of the biome in the soil have revealed that that durability was in fact an illusion. Almost the entire carbon store in the soils is what the scientists call highly labile. It can be broken down by bacteria and archaea and molds and other things and fungi and released to the atmosphere when the conditions are right over relatively short periods of time. So we have to be aware of the security of drawdown. This is one of the key things we need to keep in mind. The other thing that we need to understand is the economics of drawdown, and we'll come to that a bit later. But just sufficient to say at the moment that we are offering a service rather than a product with drawdown. So the reason we're not offering a product is that the carbon that we draw down has to be stored somewhere out of use. Yeah. So it's important to understand that. Of course, there are some pathways that give you co-benefits, and we'll come to them lately. So you get a product you can sell out of the drawdown process. But nevertheless, the general principle that it's a service rather than a product is important. And of course, the market for that service is very immature. We have very few buyers for carbon drawdown that will benefit the entire planet. When you're dealing with such large scalable options as the many drawdown options, initial prices are likely to be high, particularly where we're using non-biological pathways for drawdown. So biological pathways are things like seaweed and forest reforestation and so forth. But non-biological pathways like direct air capture are likely to have very high initial costs. And this can be off-putting to some, like wind and solar versus coal. For decades, much more expensive, now coming because of scalability, because of the fact we're using it at the gigawatt scale, becoming far cheaper. So we face the same sort of problems in terms of drawdown. I'd like to now turn to two particular pathways that I think, well, Sure. Someone's just written in saying stored out of use. What about using this to make roads and so forth? Well, that is true. And for a small amount, that will be the outcome. But at the gigaton scale, at the scale we're talking about here, the multi-gigaton scale, a lot of it will be stored either in geological rock strata, deep in the ocean, in soils, or in the biosphere somewhere. And even the biosphere, as I said, is a relatively small store. It might actually be worth just talking about that briefly. So if we do think about storing carbon at scale in the biosphere, we've said that in soils, it's very labile. It's only in the last few years been realised how labile. Storage in forests is also becoming a problem simply because of changing climates and the impacts on species like tree pests. So bark beetle dieback across the northern hemisphere is one example where changing climates have led to a destabilisation of carbon stores and an impairment really of our capacity to grow more forests, at least forests similar to the ones that grew there previously in those regions. So that's just really to revisit that issue of that durability and storage, and the fact that this is really a service rather than a product. So let's just turn to silicate rocks. Silicate rocks offer one of the, I think, most promising, one of the two most promising opportunities for long-term drawdown. They may not be the ones that'll get the financing initially, but in the longer term, the virtue they have is that they offer both potential large-scale storage and high security of storage. So let's look at silicate rocks. Silicate rocks are formed in the oceans, along the mid-ocean ridges. As they decay, or in the deep ocean, the mantle, as they decay, they draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and form a carbonate. So if you think about that, you get a large volume of rock where you had a smaller volume. So among the most potent or most active of the silicate rocks is a group called the olivines. Olivines are a fairly common rock. You don't see it often at the surface because it decays quickly. But olivine has the property that if you take 1 kilogram of olivine, finely grind it up and leave it in soils or on beaches or whatever, you'll capture within months anyway, most likely 1.25 kilograms of CO2. So a kilogram of olivine, 1.25 kilograms of CO2 captured. Not all rocks are as high quality as olivine, but we can assume somewhere between 100 grams and 1.25 kilograms. It's be 150 grams would be about the average for Earth's continental rocks, through to 1.25 kilograms for very high quality rocks such as olivine. So the science that's been done around this suggests that the utilisation of silicate rocks can offer us a drawdown potential which is the equivalent of between 30 and 300 parts per million of CO2 out of the atmosphere by 2100. We're obviously dealing here with many, 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 many gigatons of silicate rocks, but the rocks exist at that volume. And of course, we know how to quarry them and to distribute them. Just last year, a very interesting study of co-benefits of silicate rocks was published out of the southern US, which looked at experimental trials whereby ground up silicate rocks were laid out over cornfields, fields of growing corn, and that corn crop saw a between 10 and 20% increase in yield. So the rocks themselves, of course, have lots of minerals in them, and those fresh minerals help plants to grow. So that was a very positive study. A second study, however, of the economics of using silicate rocks and the drawdown potential, this time from South America, from Brazil, showed that if we use conventional methods to quarry rocks, and that of course means the use of burning of fossil fuels, and to grind those rocks and then transport them, the entire benefit of using high quality silicate rocks is lost if the transport has to go more than 500 kilometers. So if you're moving the rocks more than 500 kilometers, you'll emit more CO2 through burning fossil fuels than you'll get from drawing down. it brings out an important point that while silicate rocks have enormous potential, until we decarbonise the grid and transport and our industrial processes, the full potential of the utilisation of silicate rocks is going to remain beyond our grasp. So I think that focus on decarbonising the grid, on decarbonising industrial processes and transport is absolutely essential, because it will give us earlier access to one of the most potent tools in the drawdown toolkit. There are some potential shortcuts we can take with silicate rocks. Earth's natural processes grind up very, very large volumes of rocks, particularly in glaciers. And as you're doubtless aware, the glaciers of the world are retreating, and particularly in Greenland, at the glacial snouts, what we're seeing is as the ice decays and melts away, huge volumes of what is called rock flour are being exposed. And this is highly ground up rock that has been ground up by the ice as the ice travels across the continental crust of Greenland. Now, the capacity of that particular ground up rock seems to be on the order of about 170 grams per kilogram of drawdown potential, as I mentioned earlier. The great benefit, of course, is that rock is available at sea level, is already ground up. It simply needs to be transported and distributed in order to release its potential to draw down CO2 from the atmosphere. And it's available at the gigaton scale. There are lots and lots of that sort of rock flour there. So they offer a potential ready experiment, whether we decide to try to experiment by distributing that rock flour in the oceans or on land. I think these are worthwhile things to look at to see if we can get an early start on the use of silicate rocks through accessing a source such as Greenland rock flour. I'd like to now move on to really the other, what I think is great potential pathway. And notice I'm not talking about technologies here, I'm talking about pathways, because the pathway of getting CO2 out of the atmosphere into a safe and secure storage, yes, it relies on technology, but there is much more than technology involved in many of these pathways. So in terms of seaweed, the oceans cover about 71% of the Earth's surface. Seaweed grows in large parts of the oceans. Seaweed is very fast growing. So compared with the plant on land, seaweed doesn't have to produce a trunk or roots or branches. It consists entirely of the photosynthetic or productive part of the organism. And this allows it to grow fast. So they grow at up to 60 centimetres a day and perhaps more in very optimal conditions for some kelps. So of course, all that growth means it's capturing lots of CO2. Where's the CO2 coming from? Well, in the oceans, we have the equivalent of an entire dissolved atmosphere worth of gas sitting in the oceans. So the oceans, as you're probably aware, are much larger than the atmosphere. The oceans are 500 times larger, in fact, than the atmosphere in terms of mass. And they're so large that in the interstices of the liquids, we have a dissolved atmosphere full of gas. And it's that. And of course, the balance of gases in that dissolved atmosphere in the oceans is in balance with the chemical composition of the atmosphere itself. The partial pressure of the gases across the ocean atmosphere interface makes sure that that is the case. So it's basically an identical atmosphere worth of gases in the oceans. And that's what seaweeds use to grow. They can have an enormous impact, at least locally, in terms of CO2 levels in the ocean. CO2 in the oceans, it forms a weak acid. And if you look at the pH of the ocean in areas around seaweed farms, it can be as alkaline as 10. Typically, it's 8.2 at the moment, 8.1, and acidifying. But because seaweeds take so much of the CO2 out of the atmosphere, we have a situation where we create an alkaline environment. And of course, that is great for anything that grows a skeleton or shells. So seaweed farms are looking increasingly as a preferred place for kind of ocean permaculture, if you want, or the growth of fish and so forth. So I think that the other thing I should say is that the seaweed industry is a very old industry. It's centuries old. It's extremely well established. It's very diversified, and it's growing very, very quickly. So in terms of an industrial engine to move sequestration forward, the seaweed industry, I think, offers lots of promise. In terms of capture, we know about the capture of CO2 by seaweed. That is well understood, and we know we can go forward there. When it comes to storage, though, of that captured CO2, it's a different matter. And the most stable storage of CO2, or most long-term storage of CO2, I should mention, in the oceans, is if the CO2 gets below 1 kilometre in depth. So if the seaweed, for example, is growing by the shore, and a storm event pushes the seaweed into the head of a submarine canyon, and then gravity takes it down below 1 kilometre, the CO2 embodied in that seaweed, or the carbon embodied in that seaweed, stays out of the coupled upper atmosphere oceanic system for centuries, millennia, or maybe millions of years. The science is still fairly open on that, but it's certainly long enough term storage to give us some real options, I think, for utilising a pathway that gets the CO2 out of the atmosphere, and at the very minimum gives us a break, maybe helps permanently solve the problem. So, when we're talking about these global scale interventions, there are plenty of reasons for caution. Yeah. So in the oceans, people have asked me, well, what happens if that seaweed gets to the deep ocean affects life in the deep ocean, which is entirely possible. And that's something we need to learn much more about. We don't know much about it at the moment. But could I just point to a fact that I think should give us confidence that we can learn as we go with this? And that fact is that the oceans are very, very large. The oceans below 3,000 metres are the largest biome on Earth by far. They represent 95% of all habitat. They're so large, in fact, that if we were to take half of the atmospheric CO2, which should be 200 odd parts per million, and put that into the deep ocean, that half or 50% of CO2 in the atmosphere would increase the CO2 concentrations in the deep ocean below 3 kilometres just by 2%. Yeah, so we have a large storage here potentially that I think is quite important in terms of dealing with this issue. I mentioned earlier that there are significant co-benefits in seaweed production, and people are increasingly turning to the growth of fish, shellfish, oysters, and so forth in seaweed areas, and people are using seaweed, in fact, to optimise conditions for, say, spawning and the growth of spat in the oyster industry. All of this is happening, so we can see some benefits. We know that naturally a fair amount of seaweed makes its way into the deep ocean. So a key study done in 2017 showed that hundreds of tons of seaweed and possibly thousands of tons or gigatons of seaweed a year makes its way into the deep ocean naturally through being sunk into submarine canyons or washed off submarine plateau by storms or whatever. And we know we can probably increase that volume. There are a few industries which I think are extremely promising in terms of seaweed. There is sea forests in Tasmania, which is looking at the growth of a particular red seaweed in shallow waters called Asparagopsis. And Asparagopsis has the virtue that it produces a bromine compound which interferes with the production of methane in a cow's rumen. And we know the basic work's been done to show that if you feed a cow 25 grams, which is what, an ounce or so of that seaweed per day, the cow will reduce methane emissions by 98%. So trials are currently underway for the large-scale application of that Asparagopsis in Tasmania with a group called Fonterra, which are a dairy cooperative from New Zealand originally, which is the third largest exporter of dairy products on the planet. So we'll see how that all goes. So I think that that although that's not about sequestration as such, it's a promising side industry, if you want, in seaweed. In terms of sequestration potential, kelp forests off the Namibian coast is probably the most interesting of the current projects. This year is a big year for them. They will be deploying their very first arrays off the coast of Namibia, where you have a lot of upwelling that lets the seaweed grow very rapidly. The CEO of that industry is out of Royal Dutch Shell. He knows about scale, he knows about operating in the marine environment, and he knows about markets. So while the seaweed will be sold to market from that product, there will be a flow off, a natural loss of seaweed, which will be carried by the Benguela current into deep waters off Namibia. And hopefully we can demonstrate scale of sequestration as a sort of, again, a co-benefit, at least initially, of that industry. So I think the seaweed industry has enormous potential, and I think that it will be a case of learning as we go. There are huge gaps in our knowledge, and I don't want to delude anyone about that. Any number of issues could arise, which makes the seaweed industry less prospective than it looks like today. The same is true for silicate rocks. We're on a very steep learning curve. But it is very important that we start on this journey. And the reason for that is that the problem continues to grow. We are approaching Earth's tipping points. And again, the sixth assessment report by the IPCC makes this very clear. And of course, once we trigger sufficient tipping points, we will lose the opportunity to modify the future impacts of climate change, because the positive feedback loops that will be triggered will overwhelm, in all probability, our capacity to undo the damage we've done by drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere and into safe storage. I think that the drawdown industry is sort of, we've got to think of it a little bit like the development of a vaccine for COVID. I remember very well at the start of the COVID pandemic, and I have a number of friends who are in the vaccine business, people saying, well, look, you know, we'd love a vaccine, but we've never had a vaccine for coronavirus before. We don't even know whether it's possible to develop one. But the one thing I can tell you, they all said, was that it's going to take a long time and it's going to be expensive. Well, here we are now, 18 months on from that initial phase. And we've seen that it has been possible to develop vaccines. All of them have side effects. All of them have other impacts that we're all too well aware of, but they've been developed. We also know the cost has been extremely high for developing those vaccines, and they have been developed with a real sense of urgency, which is absent in the climate area. We also are seeing right now that vaccines are absolutely essential for the survival of our future in the face of the COVID threat. The same will be true for drawdown in terms of climate. And one of my great frustrations is that as we go into things like the COP coming up, COP26, very few people are taking a holistic view of the climate problem. We're focused on mitigation, on decreasing emissions, and that is absolutely essential. But we also need governments to focus on adaptation, to make sure that we are optimising our chance to minimise the damage that's already in train through damaging our climate system. And thirdly, we need the climate vaccine. We need drawdown. We all know we will not get out of this without drawdown. We cannot stay below 2 degrees without some degree of drawdown. So what I will do now is just sign off from the main part of my talk, which I triggered for about 30 minutes. And perhaps I could go through some of the questions that have been put forward. Jason, would you be able to help me with that, or how are we going to proceed?
Thank you, Tim. Actually, we're going to hand it to our moderator, Katherine Gomes, to work through some questions that she has, and then we'll get to some of the audience questions as well. So, Katherine.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Tim. That talk was really insightful, and I'm sure everybody really enjoyed it. And to just start off with the questions, I was wondering if you could give us a brief overview of the major milestones in your career, you know, coming from discovering mammalian species in New Guinea to becoming a champion of climate change and carbon removal. You know, if you could just share a brief overview of how that all happened for you.
Sure. Look, my first degree wasn't in science at all. It was in arts. I was a rather indifferent student at my Catholic boys' school, and I ended up enrolling in an English and history degree, which I completed. I was going to be a teacher, but I realised I didn't have the courage to be a teacher, particularly of high school boys, which was what I was looking at doing. So at that time in Australia, there was a boom, a minerals boom on. So I learned you could train as a geologist, even if you hadn't had a science background. So I went to a university, did a master's in geological sciences, and really fell in love with it. I found it was just wonderful. It was exactly what I should have been doing. I then went on, did a PhD in biological sciences, and got a job at a museum as curator of mammals. I've always loved New Guinea, the island of New Guinea, and adventure and all of the rest. So I ended up spending 15 years of my life discovering new mammal species in New Guinea, including 5 kinds of tree kangaroos, which are quite large and spectacular animals. So that was a wonderful phase of my life. But during that period, I realised I was witnessing some disturbing things. I climbed most of the high mountains in New Guinea, and I saw everywhere I went that the tree line was rising. And initially, I didn't understand why that was. I'd heard about climate change, but hadn't thought through all the implications. And it became very evident by the time I'd been doing this for 15 years that there was a massive climatic shift going on that was threatening the very biodiversity that I was documenting. So I did some soul searching and realised I needed to change career pathways. I had a wonderful time discovering these new species, but they simply wouldn't survive. And I didn't want to be the last person to see them. Their discoverer being the last person to see them is pretty miserable. So I embarked on work. I moved by then to South Australia, advising government on climate change, and I became involved then with the Copenhagen climate meeting. I chaired the Copenhagen Climate Council, which had a lot of business people involved. I talked very extensively with Sir Richard Branson about drawdown. He had a very pessimistic view of the outcome of the climate meetings and felt we needed an insurance policy. So I worked with him on the Virgin Earth Challenge for 12 years. We looked at over 10,000 applications dealing with drawdown. And since then, I've been involved with Seaweed groups and others. So that's how I've got to where I am today.
That's awesome. And I'm sure our Earth and every single one of us watching here today are very grateful that you made that career change.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And AirMiners supports newcomers to the carbon removal space through their Boot Up initiative. And generally, newcomers to the space have trouble overlaying different carbon removal topics like direct air capture, mineralization, and seaweed fertilization, just to name a few. I was wondering if you had any advice to newcomers to help them understand how different carbon removal strategies can be deployed in tandem to create what you refer to as the drawdown toolkit.
Sure. Look, it's a really problematic thing, this, and I've struggled with it for a long time because it's extremely complex. Some things that go under the rubric of drawdown offer, very, very short-term storage, if any at all. Some of them are actually offsets for fossil fuel use. Some of them are scalable, but only in a world where there's limitless capital. It is very, very complex. So, and I should just mention to people, you may have been expecting me to talk about direct air capture today. I kept my comments to 30 minutes because I wanted to really engage just in this Q&A. So I didn't mention direct air capture because I have questions about its scalability, at least the way the markets are currently organised. We have to build machines, build 1 million direct air capture machines to get a gigaton of CO2, and then find rock formations that this can be, the CO2 can be stored in. The costs currently of doing that look to be on the order of $260 a ton. So at those sort of costs, the scalability simply isn't there. I hope maybe it will be in future, but at the moment it isn't. The way I look at the issue is that we have an urgent problem. We need to develop scalable solutions. So this is tens of gigatons per year. And I think the example I gave you of foresting the entire lower 48 states of the USA might get us 8 gigatons a year on average over a century. I mean, that talks to scale, yeah? So it's going to be very important to do some direct air capture, to do some reforestation, all of that stuff. These will be silver buckshot on the way to the main game, the big issue, but the big issue is going to be getting tens of gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere per annum. And the pathways to do that are tragically extremely few.
Definitely. And on that note, AirMiners also supports entrepreneurs in the carbon removal space with their Launchpad initiative. And I was just wondering if broadly you had any guidance to give to entrepreneurs who are working to develop solutions and businesses in carbon removal.
Look, I'm not an entrepreneur myself, but I would give some. So the first is think about scale. All of this is about scale. So think very, very carefully about scale. Think about permanence of sequestration in terms of future markets. Largely, there's some existing, but largely future markets. And I would say also look at co-benefits. So there are some pathways that offer co-benefits. So the kelp forests off Namibia is one of those opportunities where we have large-scale growth of kelp for commercial use, which is not going to result in sequestration. But during the growth process, some kelp will be lost to the oceans, and that will potentially sequester. So my view of this is if we build up industries like that, we'll have the mechanisms ready for large-term storage when the world is ready to pay for it. Yeah. And when that will be, who knows? But, you know, can you imagine being in a situation 20 years from now, just as an example, this is thinking out loud, you know, but 20 years from now, when Earth's climate system is in massive flux, when food security is being threatened, when trillions of dollars worth of coastal real estate is under threat, when human civilization itself is under enormous pressure. Imagine if under that circumstance, you had the tool to offer people to say, we can fix this. And that's what drawdown will do. It will allow us to fix the problem in a way a vaccine allows us to fix COVID. It doesn't eliminate the problem, but we can back down from the most severe manifestations of that problem. So if I was an entrepreneur, I'd be thinking about that world rather than the quarterly return or how much money I'm going to make next year. Think about it in the longer term.
Definitely, and I think that's great guidance. And I'd like to pivot just briefly because you have such a pivotal role as a climate advocate. And I was wondering, as such an eloquent communicator, if you had any advice broadly to share with people about communicating about climate and talking to people to raise awareness about these issues and how you go about it and how you'd recommend other people starting these conversations.
Yes, look, I'm a scientist by training, so I tend to go to science first. I know a lot of people don't get that, but I try to just explain clearly the parameters of the problem, you know, the scale, the nature of the threat. Do you know, I think most people get it now. I mean, I don't know which part of the US you're in, but I know there's been floods, hurricanes, and incredible fires and droughts across the US in different parts, which are all palpable manifestations of a destabilization of the climate system. So there's probably 10% of people in the US who will never admit that or see to it for political or ideological reasons. I don't know whether I'd waste a lot of time on them, but there's probably another 30% of people who have a more open mind, who are willing to listen. And I think, you know, I've found just respectful listening is very important for people like that. They may not know. So be very respectful, hear them out and listen to their individual stories. If people feel they're heard, you have an open pathway to communication. So I tended through my life to do that. I've been climate commissioner here in Australia and met tens of thousands of people face to face, and had dealt with businessmen and so forth in the Copenhagen Climate Council. And I found that respectful listening is really important. It's the first step of establishing trust.
I think that's a really powerful notion, whether you're talking about climate change or any serious topic. That's great advice. Moving away from some of my own curiosity and into some of the questions that came in the chat and also with people's registration. We had an interesting question come through about how industry can support carbon removal through seaweed farming, and if you see any clear monetization pathways associated with seaweed fertilization.
Well, this is the great question. It's being sort of worked out in real life at the moment. There are potentially co-benefits that could be used with seaweed growing. So ocean permaculture is a very good one. But there are trade-offs as well. So if you were simply interested in making a profit, you may decide to put your ocean permaculture array near a market so you can minimize transport costs and get the food there fresh. And that may not be the best place for ocean sequestration. Yeah. So this is where we're trying to work out. The great thing about the Namibian work is that we're using a bulk product, feeding it directly into an existing market for seaweed use, and some inevitable byproduct or loss will go into the deep oceans. And the focus for myself and others involved with that is to try to quantify that leakage, if you want. So that's something, a rational business person would try to minimize that leakage. I'm not sure how that is going to look, because the leakage is the service in a way that we're giving. But as the market grows, I'm confident that leakage will become a product in and of itself, in terms of a service, that's offered. It'll be a profit center in and of itself. So, I think the answer to the question is it's complicated, like everything on Earth, and think carefully about what your objectives are and what the parameters you're working within are, and try to work out an optimal pathway, not just for this year's profits, but for the profits of several decades from now.
Definitely. And staying within the marine space, we had a question come in. Someone wanted to ask you what you think the key questions or issues are right now that marine carbon organizations and collaborations should be working towards in the next few months to enhance ocean-based methods of carbon removal.
Yeah, sure. Look, they're all around the drawdown. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. The drawdown aspects of the marine system is reasonably well understood. What is not understood is the storage. So, we know that marine grasses, nearshore marine seagrass and so forth, and mangrove swamps have enormous potential to draw down CO2. And under a stable climate system, they store that CO2 in sediments. But what happens as sea levels start to rise? Is that storage destabilized? It's a great research question. Another research question is, what happens to that carbon that gets into the deep ocean in the form of seaweed or just marine snow or whatever else? Where does it end up, and how long does it reside in the deep ocean? What impact might it have on biodiversity in the deep ocean? These are difficult to research questions, but really, really important ones, I think, in terms of just basic science. So there are other sequestration questions as well, or storage questions that we need to look at. So that duration of storage in the deep ocean is another relatively unconstrained quantity. It's at least centuries, but is it millennia or millions of years? These are important things to know. I think I'll leave it there. There's so many uncertainties, but there's some of the key ones.
Definitely. And
sorry, could I just cover off on one more area there? It's the use of microalgae and plankton to capture CO2. So we know iron filings, iron fertilization experiments, particularly with silica in the Southern Ocean, have great potential to promote algal blooms. There's a whole lot we don't know about that. Are there toxic algae which are being promoted as well? But equally importantly, the question of under what conditions does that carbon captured in the plankton sink below 1 kilometre? So these are really fundamental questions that, if we could use iron fertilization safely as a means of sequestration, we would have another tool in the toolkit. But at the moment, the science is so rudimentary that is not really even option, isn't available to us. And in fact, the Compact on Biodiversity, Convention on Biodiversity, has specifically forbids ocean fertilization experimentation for that reason.
Wow. And while you were answering that question, we had another question come in the chat in response to that from Allison, asking what your thoughts are on the use of seaweed for products as a means of storage over decades.
Well, for sure, maybe is my answer. I don't know. It's a bit like, we thought that storage of carbon in the soils was going to be decades or centuries. Turns out that's not the case. That the archaea have such a formidable Swiss Army knife capacity to break apart molecules that in the soil, that capacity is very short. So let's have a look at what some of those pathways might be. Let's have a look at their scalability, and let's have a look at their duration. So to do some science around that. Of course, it'd be nice if it worked out, but let's see.
And also from our audience tonight, we had a question either in terms of regulation or in terms of ecology or geography. Do you see there being a most friendly country or region for kelp growing?
Yeah, look, some of the traditional East Asian countries have both the scale of the industry and the potential for some real support. So probably the foremost would be South Korea, which is already talking about blue carbon as a potential, sequestration and method for payment. This is, it's not happening yet, but there is some excellent marine scientists in South Korea who are looking at that. I think, again, the Namibian example is a very, very good one. It's fully commercial. That's going into operation without hope of an immediate payment for sequestration, but is developing a facility which will permit some sequestration. So, and of course, all of the regulation about nearshore ocean usage and so forth is all part of the package of how fast or slow this is going to go. So countries like Namibia, which have a fairly proactive response to dealing with regulatory issues, are good. Yeah, are better than, say, countries which are burdened with bureaucracy.
Makes sense. Also from our audience tonight, someone wanted to know your thoughts on scaling carbon removal, specifically seaweed and mineralization, in a way that is equitable in terms of environmental justice, and how you think that could happen in the future. Well,
that's a great question. Look, silicate rocks are rather like oil in that their distribution around the earth is not homogeneous. There are some areas which have a large amounts of it and other areas that don't. So I guess there you have the potential for a disequilibrium or for increasing inequality if some areas are particularly very rich in silicate rocks. So my country of Australia, for example, is very, very rich in silicate rocks, and we have great mining expertise. I could imagine Australia sort of cornering the market early on. So I'm not sure silicate rocks are going to offer equality without a very careful thought about how that might be done. In terms of seaweed, again, certain areas of the world are more prospective in terms of seaweed growing than others. There are 660 marine canyons identified around the planet on continental margins. Those areas are great potential areas for growing seaweed and transporting seaweed into the depths, but again, they're not distributed equally around the planet. Submarine plateaus, likewise, but the good thing about submarine plateaus is that they, many of them are in developing countries. So the Pacific Islands, for example, are a good example where you can imagine the development of a seaweed industry that would offer a significant benefit in terms of income equality, of boosting incomes in some of those poorer regions, and the Caribbean likewise, through the development of seaweed farms. But we shall see. I think, again, this is an area that needs really deep consideration. It's something I must say I haven't probably put enough effort into.
Definitely, still a very insightful answer, and I know I appreciated it a lot. And moving on to a question from Siobhan from our Q&A section. What do you see as the potential risks and downsides to mineralization besides transport, which you noted in your talk? And what studies do you think need to be conducted to de-risk mineralization at large?
That's a great question. Look, I think it depends on where the minerals are used. So if, for example, we decided to use Greenland rock flour as a pathway and decided to use it in the oceans, you could imagine creating plumes of clouded water, where high water with high silt loads that would, which would reduce phototransmission, so reduce sunlight passing through the water. That could be a downside. I guess there are whole plant communities which grow only on silicate rock outcrops. So New Caledonia, the island of New Caledonia in the Pacific is a good example of that. And so if it was just a free-for-all, it may be that some of those silicate rock communities could be mined into extinction. So there are certainly some downsides. With any of this, we need good regulation, and you need to be aware the complexity of the issues you're facing. But just off the top of my head, they're the two that I think would be the most significant risk. I guess there may be a risk as well if there are toxic metals such as arsenic and so forth in these silicate rocks, which accumulates in agricultural soils. That may be another factor that needs to be taken into account. Again, I haven't read any studies of this, but it's something for the future that we need to keep an eye on.
Definitely noted. And also going forward and thinking about some of the students and the younger crowd that are in AirMiners, you have experience in a broad range of fields from biological sciences to paleontology to the arts. If you were starting your journey in carbon removal today, what kind of chapter of the book would you recommend someone starting with in terms of understanding the underlying principles in the science?
Oh, you put me in a difficult position, Katherine, because I'd have to recommend my own books, which I don't like doing. But I've written a book called Sunlight and Seaweed, it's a couple of years old now, but it gives the basics for the seaweed industry. For silicate rocks, you've really got to go to the research papers. So, James Hansen and colleagues have produced some really good work on silicate rocks in very prestigious journals such as Nature. So they're all referenced, and you can Google those. So I would start looking at those. But if I was a young researcher starting out today, I would pick what looks to me to be a central question, science question, and try to really develop some expertise in that and try to further the scientific field. So that might be something like the risk of contaminants in the use of silicate rocks. So contaminants being toxic metals and so forth. What is the risk of that? It might be a study of ocean circulation and how long carbon stays in the deep ocean. And this can be done through isotopic tracing and other means. We can do some of this sort of stuff. So I'd pick an area like that and try to build up some expertise. And then when you've got your PhD and the world's moved on and everyone's saying, what the hell are we going to do about drawdown? You'll be out there in the front line as someone who's eminently employable and with a great career in front of you.
That's awesome advice. And then definitely don't feel bad about recommending your own books. You are a very prolific author and a great teacher. So I would also endorse your writings.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Definitely. And just as we approach the hour, I'd like to turn it back to Jason just as we conclude the event. But thank you again. This was incredibly insightful.
Thanks, Katherine.
Okay. And reiterating, thank you, Katherine, and thank you, Tim, for a very insightful talk. Want to also thank you as audience members for sharing this time with us today. I see that there's about 50 questions in the Q&A right now. So what I can do is I can kind of sift through those and maybe pass those along later to see what we can, what we could perhaps answer. Because I was thinking to your comments, Tim, it sounded like you wanted to really engage with what the audience had to say.
Yeah, indeed. Be happy to look at them.
Great. So there's that. Wanted to also thank a couple other people who are a little bit behind the scenes. First, Caitlin McCloskey, also of the University of Pennsylvania, similar to Katherine, who did a fantastic job volunteering to make this event be what it is. And of course, Tito Jankowski, from whom we've gotten tremendous support for moving forward with this. With that, just we're at the conclusion. I'm going to afterwards share the link to the post-event survey that I can share with you all so that you can give us feedback about what we did well and what we can improve on. So that's coming up in the chat right now. Also, to let you know, we are going to have a post-event networking session that's going to start immediately after we stop the webinar right now. So I'm going to send the Zoom link to that also in the chat so that we can continue the conversation amongst the attendees, go into Zoom breakout rooms there, which Zoom webinars not so is a little bit less able to do with ease, and then we'll go from there. So once again, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate all the effort that you all put into to be here, and to your incredible wealth of questions that have come up. And of course, thank you, Tim, for something that's going to be quite a memorable conversation that you had with us from AirMiners. So with that, I'm going to say good evening, good day, since you're just starting off in Australia.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason.
And,
thanks, Katherine. Good luck with everything else.
Thanks. Cheers. And we will see you next time at an AirMiners event. So thanks, everyone.